In 2010, a 16-year-old boy walked into an audition room in the UK and sang for a panel of strangers. He didn't make it through, not that year. He was told he was too young and to come back later. Most people, told that at 16, would have shrugged and moved on with their lives. He didn't. 2 years later, he came back. And this time, the panel put him in a group with 4 other boys he'd never met. They called the group One Direction. None of them knew, standing on that stage, that they were about to become the biggest boy band on the planet. This is the story of Liam Payne. He was born in Wolverhampton, England in 1993. As a kid, he ran cross-country, seriously enough that he trained for the Great North Run. But music pulled harder. By the time he auditioned for the X Factor the second time, in 2010, he wasn't just a kid with a nice voice. He'd been rejected once, in public, on television, and he came back anyway. That's the part people forget when they talk about One Direction's origin story. The band wasn't built by 5 strangers getting lucky. It was built, in part, by one of them refusing to let a first no be the final answer.
Here's the thing nobody likes to say out loud about shows like the X Factor. They are not designed to find the most talented person in the room. They're designed to produce a story the audience can vote for. Liam happened to have both, the voice and the story. But the format itself doesn't actually care which one you're selling. It packages teenagers as content first, and artists second. And it does it on live television, in front of millions of strangers who get to have an opinion about a 16-year-old's future before he's even allowed to vote.
The X Factor put Liam, Harry Styles, Niall Horan, Zayn Malik, and Louis Tomlinson together as a group, when none of them advanced far enough as soloists. They placed 3rd that season. On paper, that's not a fairy tale ending. In practice, it was the beginning of one of the most commercially dominant acts in modern pop music history. 5 albums, 4 world tours, stadiums full of teenagers screaming lyrics back at 5 boys who, a few years earlier, had been strangers standing in line for an audition. It happened fast, faster than most people's careers happen at all. One year, they were unknowns competing on a reality show. A couple of years later, they couldn't walk through an airport without a security detail. That kind of acceleration doesn't leave a lot of room for anyone to catch up emotionally to what's happening to them. Adults with decades of life experience struggle with sudden fame. These were teenagers.
Inside the band, Liam became known as one of its steadier presences, one of the writers, someone who leaned into the business side of things as much as the performing side. He co-wrote songs. He paid attention to contracts and production, the unglamorous machinery behind the screaming crowds. Fame, at that scale, doesn't leave much room to be a normal 20-year-old. Liam was thrown into it younger than almost anyone in the group, a teenager living a life that most adults couldn't handle, on a schedule that never really stopped, with a version of himself being sold in magazines and on bedroom posters that he had very little control over.
In 2016, the band went on what was officially called an indefinite hiatus. Liam moved into a solo career, releasing his first solo single in 2017 and an album, LP1, in 2019. He talked in interviews about missing being with the boys and about hoping there'd be a way back to the group someday. That hope wasn't unusual. Reunions happen. What was less visible at the time was what fame had cost him to get there, and what going solo, losing the 4 people who'd been the only others on the planet who understood exactly what he'd been through, actually meant.
In 2021, Liam spoke publicly about something he'd kept mostly private, that during his years in One Direction, he had struggled with alcohol and prescription medication, and that at his lowest point, it had brought him to severe suicidal thoughts. He didn't frame it as a dramatic confession. He framed it mostly as an explanation for behavior fans had noticed, for gaps in his public presence, for a version of himself he said he wasn't proud of. It's a familiar shape when you look at enough stories like his. The fame arrives first, and the reckoning with what it costs arrives years later, quietly, usually far from the cameras that were there for the rise, in a much smaller room than the stadiums, with a much smaller audience than the one that used to scream his name.
And it should say something, that this is the pattern, not the exception. Almost every young star who's lived through this kind of overnight fame eventually gives some version of the same interview. The one where they admit that what looked like the best years of their life were, underneath, some of the hardest. The fact that we keep hearing that same confession, decade after decade, from a new 20-something every time, should probably worry us more than it does.
By 2024, Liam appeared publicly to be in a better place. He'd been open about periods of sobriety. He had a young son, Bear, born in 2017. In October of that year, he traveled to Buenos Aires, Argentina, not for a show of his own, but to see Niall Horan, his former bandmate, who was performing there on tour. The two had reportedly grown distant in recent years, and Liam had posted that it had been a while since they'd properly spoken, that there was no bad vibes, just things to catch up on. He attended Niall's concert. He posted videos of himself in the crowd, singing along. For a few days, by every visible account, it looked like an ordinary trip. Old friends, old songs, a reunion of sorts. The kind of quiet, unremarkable reconnection most people get to have without a single stranger paying attention.
We're not going to walk through the final hours in detail. What's publicly known is this. On October 16th, 2024, staff at the hotel where Liam was staying called for help, reporting a guest who appeared to be under the influence and behaving erratically. A short time later, Liam fell from the third-floor balcony of his hotel room. He was 31 years old. Argentine authorities later said the fall itself caused his death, and toxicology findings indicated multiple substances in his system. In the months that followed, several people connected to that stay, including a hotel employee, were charged in connection with supplying him with drugs in the days before he died.
We're not going to dramatize what happened next. What matters isn't the fall itself. What matters is that a 20-year journey, from a rejected audition to the biggest band on earth, to a solo career, to a quiet public admission that fame had nearly broken him, ended in a hotel room, alone, in a city he'd only come to visit for a few days, surrounded by people who, by the accounts that followed, were more interested in what he could give them than in whether he made it home.
The response afterward said something about the scale of what One Direction had actually meant to people. Vigils were held outside the hotel. Fans who were teenagers when the band formed were adults with careers and children of their own, and they showed up anyway. Some of them crying in ways they probably hadn't expected to, for a stranger they'd never actually met, but had somehow grown up alongside. Fellow musicians, people who'd worked with him, competed against him, grown up in the industry alongside him, spoke about a kindness that didn't always make headlines, but that people who'd actually met him kept bringing up, unprompted, in the days after. It's worth noticing that. The headlines were about the fall, the charges, the toxicology report. The people who actually knew him kept talking about something else entirely. Here's the part of this story that isn't really about Liam Payne at all. There's a specific kind of danger in being handed enormous success before you've had the chance to become a fully formed adult. It isn't just the money or the attention. It's that the version of you the world falls in love with gets frozen at 19, at 20, while the actual person underneath keeps aging, keeps struggling, keeps needing things that stadiums full of screaming fans simply cannot provide. Liam talked about that gap himself, publicly, years before his death. The difference between the person on stage and the person trying to hold himself together once the lights went down. he wasn't unique in that. It's a pattern that shows up again and again in stories like his. Enormous early achievement, a quiet private cost, and a public that only really pays attention to the cost after it's already too late to do anything about it.
And maybe the most uncomfortable part isn't even that. It's that we, the audience, are part of the machine that does this. We were the ones who voted him onto that stage at 16. We're the ones who bought the tickets, streamed the songs, and turned 5 ordinary young men into something closer to property than people. None of that makes what happened his fault, or anyone else's fault specifically, but it does mean the industry that built him and the culture that consumed him walked away from this story completely unchanged. The uncomfortable truth isn't that Liam Payne had a tragic ending. It's that the conditions that produce stories like his, sudden fame, no roadmap, a childhood spent performing instead of growing up, are still exactly the same today as they were in 2010. Nothing about the machine that built One Direction has been fixed. It's just building someone else's version of Liam Payne right now, somewhere on some other stage, and we probably won't know their name yet. Not until one day we do. This was Undertone. One life. One truth. Even one that ended somewhere he never meant to stay.